once again to the Two Matts and the Jeff podcast. I am Matt Moyer along with Matt Bannon and Jeff Moyer, and we're just some middle-aged guys that are talking sports. And today we're talking NBA, and we're talking NBA coaches, and we're looking at the all-time greatest NBA coaches. So I'm going to get started right away with my list. On my number 5, best coach of all time is one that some of you younger kids might not know as much, Lenny Wilkens. So I picked Lenny Wilkens. He was, for quite a while, the all-time win leader in the NBA. 32 seasons. He was with the Sonics, the Blazers, the Cavs, the Hawks, the Raptors, the Knicks. He has .536 winning percentage. He was the coach of the year in 93, 94. And I just think there's all-time wins and the longevity. It's hard to be a head coach in the NBA, and to do it for 32 years, you got to be pretty darn good. So there's my number 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go. All right. So my number 5, older fellow as well, Chuck Daly. Chuck Daly. He was coach of the Cavaliers, which I didn't really know and remember, but apparently he wasn't very good there. But he was really good with his other team, with the Pistons, and then he finished up with the Nets and the Magic.
Well, who's good in Cleveland? Nobody's good in Cleveland.
But so anyway, he won 2 championships. He was, and I started looking up, I guess this is something meaningful when I started looking up coaches, that he was a one-time NBA All-Star coach. The All-Star, I guess, because he must, I think it goes from the previous year, right?
Yeah, that had a record.
Right. So anyway, so I guess, that was a big thing they were mentioning. 59.3% winning percentage. And he also won the gold medal with the 92 Dream Team.
Which, although this is about NBA coaches, that took a lot more skill than I think people give you credit for. Because to manage all those personalities, which is what Chuck Daly did a great job at.
Yeah, well, you probably remember from the Dream Team thing that he thinks that he had the college team beat them in that scrimmage just to make a point. Like, you're not untouchable.
Right. And
So,
for those of you that don't know who he is, he's no longer with us. So you can't ask him about those things. But he was what they considered to be quite the master of all those personalities, which I think was quite a skill for the Dream Team because, that's not easy. I think it's harder to do today maybe than then, but still not easy to do. To take guys who were all the best player in their team and say, you're going to sit the bench. You're not going to start at least.
Right. All right, so my number 5, going with longevity thing, is Don Nelson, who is the current all-time wins leader at 1335, Hall of Famer, 5 different teams, Bucks, Warriors, Knicks, Mavs, Warriors again. And he was coach of the year 3 times, apparently. Everybody remembers his first run with the Warriors with Run TMC, Tim Hardaway, Mitch Richmond, and Chris Mullin. And he pioneered the point forward concept with Paul Pressey, who I'm not sure you guys really remember. With
I remember the name, but
back in the 80s, early 80s or whatever. So Don Nelson, he was my number 5, mostly for longevity, like you mentioned with Lenny Wilkens.
All right, so my number, and my 3, 4, and 5 have bounced around in the last couple of days, and even game time decisions switched some things out. But my number 4, I have to look at my correct numbers here, is Pat Riley. So Pat Riley, fantastic career in basketball, which is still continuing from a player to a coach to an executive. But he was head coach with the Lakers, the Showtime Lakers, of course, as you know, Matt's a big Showtime Lakers fan, and Jeff. The Knicks and the Heat. He's got 5 titles, 4 with the Lakers, 1 with the Heat. 636 win percentage. NBA Coach of the Year in 90, 93, and 97. He made the playoffs every year as a coach. His team made the playoffs, which is, you got to have the players, but that's still pretty exceptional to do. 171 playoff wins. That's second most ever as a coach. And I think I probably would have put him higher, except some of the guys above him, it's pretty hard to bump down the list because I just think he's a phenomenal coach, phenomenal basketball mind, phenomenal executive.
Motivator.
And pretty darn good player, evidently, which is before my time. But
Okay. My number 4 is, and again, maybe you were saying the same thing, but 3, 4, I was back and forth. My number 4 is Greg Popovich. Only one team, the Spurs. You think of the Spurs, you think of Greg Popovich. 5 NBA championships, 3-time NBA Coach of the Year, 4-time NBA All-Star Coach. He is the longest tenured coach currently in the NBA. I saw something about most wins.
Yeah, I was going to say, man, you said Don Nelson. What I saw has
too.
Popovich as the
because-
most wins. In 2019, he
Passed.
passed
Don.
Okay, so I was going to say, when you saw it, I'm like,
Yeah.
I wonder if I
Well,
misread
my
something.
thing was probably from before
Okay.
now.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I was going to say, I was going to bring it up, but
Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I wrote that. Okay, and he had the most winning seasons as a head coach. So most winning seasons. So Greg Popovich for me is number 4.
All right. My number 4, and the same thing sort of went for me, is my actually 2, 3, 4 went back and forth or whatever all over the place. So my number 4 is Red Auerbach.
Whoa, 4.
Yep.
Oh,
So-
I think you're dissing Red Auerbach a little bit, putting him at 4. But go
yeah,
ahead.
Hold on. So everyone knows Red Auerbach, 9 rings, Hall of Famer, of course. Celtics from 50 to 66, Washington Capitals from 46 to 49, and the Tri-Cities Blackhawks 49-50 or whatever, which I never even heard of.
Me
And I've
neither.
heard a lot of basketball teams even from back then. Overall win percentage is 662, playoffs 589. Everybody remembers him for his stogie after they win. I had him at 3, but I dropped him to 4 because his win percentage for me in that era should have been better, which I feel is from the competition from the 60s or whatever. I mean, there's not as many teams, so maybe the competition was okay based on that there's not as many teams to spread out that thing. But as far as from an athletic standpoint, you got to figure that in the 60s, you're not getting the athletes that you are nowadays, and even in the 80s and 90s or whatever. And then I put plus he's a Celtic, so I just had to drop him.
Well, I would the point back actually that I would make, Matt,
Yeah.
not specific to Auerbach, but I'll talk about him later, is when there's less teams, it should theoretically be harder to win because the talent doesn't get spread out as much. So you're not playing the team like the Sixers were a few years ago that was just god awful because there was not as many teams. So the talent is bunched up on those teams,
Right.
theoretically. But it's hard to say. Listen, it's always hard to compare errors to
Right.
errors. That's
Right.
very, and some of this is definitely apples to oranges because some of these coaches might have had the benefit of guys that were able to recruit other guys to come on their team that were players.
Right. Well, when I did it, we always talk about trying not having the same
Yeah.
thing or whatever, trying to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah,
So.
but it's interesting though that when we get to a little bit further up the list, my son asked me about some guys, and he didn't really know much about Red Auerbach because that's going back quite a way. So if you kids don't know him,
Look
you
him
need to
up.
go Google him because
Yeah.
he's up there. But he is not my number 3. We're going on to number 3, and my number 3 is Popovich, and I had him as the most wins, 5 titles, Coach of the Year. He's been with the team since '96, and you think about that. How many coaches in this day and age stick around for more than 3, 4, 5 years? Even great coaches,
Right.
they just don't. It doesn't happen very often. And to be with a team that long and have that sustained quality of basketball that the Spurs had for those years, and they're not quite as good anymore. But they're not like
No, I think one of the
bottom
reasons
dwellers.
is that because it's in San Antonio and it's not a major city.
Not the coast.
Yeah, he's not probably getting the heat from if he was in New York City or whatever.
Oh, you're saying okay.
As far as longevity, that he's comfortable. It's probably just a comfortable situation.
Well, now he's got the resume for it because
Right.
you're right. Earlier on in cities like New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles, if you're not performing early on, so I don't know how great his early career was, but they moved pretty quickly into being
I just meant even
the
staying.
best
Like
team
he
in
probably
the
just.
NBA for quite a while.
I'm saying even just staying there.
What was his first year as head coach?
96 is what I had.
Okay, so I mean they won a title in '99.
Right.
It was a straight shortened season.
I just meant
Whatever,
more
but that's
so
pretty good.
longevity. Like he's just probably comfortable. Like it's just
Yeah.
an easy or
Well, and it's tough,
situation.
like you said, message-wise.
Yeah.
Like the players eventually, even over the course of say a dozen seasons or something, vets might tune him out, but his message
Right.
resonates with them. So
Well, and I think he had the benefit too there of having like a Tim Duncan, who is a guy that's going to come in and work with a coach, and
He's also a quiet superstar.
Yeah, he's not going to tune out the message. So but I think that goes hand in hand with the coach creating a climate and an atmosphere with the organization, with your best players. That these are the kind of players we want to be on our team. So the coach has a lot of influence, and I'm quite certain now with his body of work, he has a lot of influence on that team. And like I said, they're not bottom dwellers right now. They're not at the top, but that West is stacked.
Right.
A lot of great teams out there. So I don't. If he sticks around, and he's 72 is what I saw. So who knows how much longer he's going to stick around. I could see them certainly rising back up to the top if he sticks around for a while.
All right, so my number 3, we flip-flopped. I have Pat Riley as my number 3. Those of you that know Pat Riley, I guess you'll probably forget about the Knicks time when he was there because they didn't win. When you think about championships, he won 5 NBA
super
champs.
competitive.
They
in
were
these
definitely
years.
great. I'm
They
not
were
saying.
in- They were in the hunt every
Right.
year, but they got stopped by.
Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that. That's what I was going to say.
Exactly, yeah. And anyway, yeah, all the stuff, same things that you wrote, but again, big time is the Showtime Lakers when he was there. So,
All right. Well, my number 3 is Pat Riley.
I thought he'd be higher.
No, Lakers, Knicks, Heat. Of course, 5 rings, Hall of Famer. Best executive after coaching. My thing that I wrote down from was he had the famous guarantee of guaranteeing another title after the Lakers 87 championship. He got on the stage after the parade and said, "We're coming back. We're going to win it back to back." And his team really had no choice but to back that up. I mean, that's a lot of pressure to put. I mean, you think about that as a coach, you really don't want to do that to your team.
Right.
But he's a master motivator. That's what I always think of when I think of Pat Riley, or whatever. Like even as an exec with the Heat, he motivates Spoelstra and their staff and everything to get the best out of their players. I think he's really good, and that he went after and got Butler for those reasons because that's the type of player that he wants on his team. So Riley, to me, is just that's another reason why I bumped him up above Auerbach, just because. I think overall, I mean, as a coach, but even beyond that, he's just a master motivator. So
Well, and see, there's a difference, Matt, is that I looked at just the body of coaching work, because Auerbach spent a good deal of time as an executive.
Too, yeah.
And I tried to not weigh that into the equation as much, but it's hard, of course, for the whole body work. So my number 2 is Red Auerbach. We talked a lot about him. The name that I saw out there that I would say is the godfather of the NBA. And, this is a guy, if you don't know him, 30 years with the Celtics. You already said 9 titles, Hall of Fame. I just had 1 year that he was Coach of the Year, which was 65, which was interesting. But I think he's similar to all the things you pointed out about Pat Riley, even with a lot of the things he did. Because once he left the coaching ranks and made a player coach, which was, something unheard of and stuff, and still very bizarre to me, to be honest with you. But anyway, really a guy that orchestrated a lot of things, and I wasn't around watching basketball at that time. But when I a lot of times when you think about some of these lists, I just think, who comes to my mind? Those are the guys that are probably going to be on the top of your list. And when you think about the greatest coaches of all time, I think you put him in the conversation, no doubt. So he's my number 2 on my list.
He's my number 2. I'm not much else, but I think the interesting thing as we do these lists, like you said, is I start to look. I didn't realize, like I said, I didn't even heard of the Tri-City, Black Hawks and all this stuff. Now, something else I wrote down, it said something about the NBA Coach of the Year was called the Red Auerbach Trophy.
Oh, really?
So I don't know.
Is it still?
I guess assuming so. I think so. Another thing I read about him, he said his big thing, he's known for team play. So I guess he really liked the team aspect rather than the individual. Like obviously, very different now. When you think of the NBA now, is very much an individual type of thing. And but yeah, you guys said pretty much everything else with Red Auerbach.
So obviously, my number 2 is Greg Popovich, and I think you guys have said everything that can be said about him. Will be in the Hall of Fame. Let's see. I think he's the best coach who really didn't. Besides, he did have Robinson and Duncan, but most of these other coaches had more to work with. As far as that's another reason why I bumped him up over Auerbach and Riley, because I think that they all had multiple superstars wherever they were. So I just felt that he was the best coach without superstars.
Right.
And I also have that I think he would have another title if Ray Allen didn't bail out LeBron in 2013. And then I put down that he'll probably end up with an Olympic gold too if they play the Olympics this summer. Because he's the head coach of the Olympics. So yeah. So Pop was my number 2.
Well, before you get to our number 1, because obviously it's probably going to be the same guy.
Yeah.
But just as you kind of were mentioning there, I thought all these coaches that we're talking about, they had superstar players. Like the tops of the tops best players. So you always, I guess it's always that question of who makes who better. Is it the coach making the player, the player making the coach?
Well, and I, it's that's actually the point that I'm going to make with my number one.
I was going to say,
I'm going to steal a little bit of thunder here since I get to go first to the number one, which I'm assuming we all have the same, which is Phil Jackson. So Phil Jackson, 18 years coaching. He's got the best winning percentage at .703, best of all time. 193 playoff wins, best of all time. 11 titles. So, the old more rings than he's got fingers. Not to mention his time as a player, which was, pretty substantial. 13 championships as a player and coach. He was, coach of the year. He's in the Hall of Fame. So a couple of things about him, because of course, everyone's going to say, well, he had Michael Jordan. He had Kobe and Shaq. Yes, absolutely he did. But here's the thing, when you look, I'll point out the Michael Jordan and maybe let you guys talk about the rest, is it's one thing to have a superstar. He surrounded him with players that now we think of Scottie Pippen as a superstar, but Scottie Pippen was nothing when he came to that team. Right. And you look at who else did he have as a superstar. Eventually he got Dennis Rodman. He had to massage that Dennis Rodman situation as a coach like nobody else. Managing the Dennis Rodman personality and getting the most out of him and getting the rest of your team not to feel animosity about that, that's a skill. Getting Michael Jordan to pass the ball to Paxton and Kerr to make those shots they made is not an easy thing, because the only other person that could keep Michael Jordan from scoring all those points is
Dean Smith.
Dean Smith, that's right. So, the Zen master here, Phil Jackson, who was able to get those personalities, and I'll let you guys talk about the Lakers and whoever else, but I think there's a lot to be said for that. So it's not just having the best player in the world on your team. And, when you look again, a couple other things about that Bulls team, and then I'll let you go, is just look at some of the other guys. Luke Longley and Bill Wennington and Invisible Cartwright during the first run were his centers. They're nothing. They're role players, but he got them to work collectively as a unit to get the maximum out of them. And he got the maximum out of guys like Luke Longley and B.J. Armstrong, who's not a particularly great player. I think he made an all-star team one year on the coattails of some great coaching and stuff like that. And Steve Kerr, who is just a good player, but a role player. Paxton, those guys. I'm forgetting the power forward on that team. Horace Grant, who again, when he left, good player, not great player, but felt like a great player when they played together. So Phil Jackson, there you go. I'll let you guys talk the rest of the stuff about
Phil Jackson. I find it interesting with all these coaches and all these years that they've coached. Like, he won one-time Coach of the Year. Like, who wins the Coach of the Year during these other times? Like, it's just funny to me. Obviously, now we play basketball together still, and some of the old guys that play with us talk about the triangle offense. Yeah. So that's one thing to remember about Phil Jackson. He's a triangle, triangle offense. Yes, he was the Zen coach because of his holistic approach to things. But yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned a lot of the other things. But yeah, I mean, I think I do believe a lot of it is players for sure. But yes, it is the personalities and how you dealt with it, especially after we watched last summer with the Last Dance stuff and how how to deal with Rodman. I mean, we knew some stuff, but not a lot of it, and to deal with that and just play with that personality. So well, yeah,
I'll keep going. Yeah, I'll look at my thing, but I'll keep going off. I'll piggyback off what you said. So you remember the scene in The Last Dance? If you watched it, if you haven't, my God, please do. The scene where they come onto the court and he has them in a circle around center court, like doing like yoga or whatever it was, which back then in the 90s was not what it is today, like commonplace or whatever. He had them doing all sorts of stretching and things like that. That the best player in the world, you're convincing Michael Jordan and everybody buying in to do things like that, to reading assignments. He would give the Lakers, he would give Shaq and Kobe books to read during the off season. Like, what coach does that today and gets away with it? Probably none. So he not only was able to mold all those superstars into a cohesive unit every year after year, but also like just make them well-rounded men over time. I think that's a key thing of him. I'm not sure what else I have written down here. Let's see, 11 remaining Hall of Fame. I also think so. You had the winning percentage or anything. I wrote down if the Lakers bring him back to coach Kobe, Nash, and Howard instead of bringing in what's his name now? I can't even think of his name. He's the assistant with the Nets now. Mike
Dunleavy.
No, not
No.
Dunleavy. Mike
D'Antoni.
D'Antoni. Yeah, whatever. If they bring him back, because they talked about that, instead of D'Antoni,
Right.
I bet you Kobe has 6 instead of 5 or whatever. So, but yeah, Phil Jackson by far, to me, was the greatest NBA coach of all time. I mean, he could, with all his powers that he could as far as molding people and keeping guys together and playing as a team, eventually that wore out with Shaq and Kobe in 04. I mean, they had Malone, Gary Payton, and they still couldn't make it work because, that's just a little bit asking much of a coach there to mold all those guys in.
Well, you mentioned Tex Winter, which if you guys don't
Yeah.
know him, you need to Google him.
Yeah.
But a good coach knowing how to use your assistant coach, and Tex Winter is a great basketball mind that's probably not known by a lot of guys, but
Yeah.
he is. He really is the orchestrator of the
Yes.
triangle offense that Phil Jackson said, "Oh, I'm going to listen to my assistants," which is something, look on the benches these days and see how many assistants there are. There's another thing to manage those guys and get the maximum out of them,
Right.
which clearly, at least in some cases, he did.
Yeah.
So, let's put a couple honorable mentions in there. So I just have 2 on my list, one of which we already mentioned. Chuck Daly was an honorable mention on my list. Fantastic coach, could have made the top 5, did on some lists. And another guy I added, and maybe this is because of his Philadelphia connection, is Larry Brown. But Larry Brown had a lot of success with a lot of different teams, bumped around a lot, and managed a lot of great personalities, Allen Iverson being one of them, and a lot of other things. And he's going to a lot of different teams and had a lot of good success in a lot of places, and I think that speaks to the quality that's there and longevity. He's coaching in college now because he wants to, probably not because he was, he could be coaching in the NBA, and he's getting up there too. I'm sure he could just retire if he wanted to. He's totally in his 70s, I'm sure. So those were my 2 honorable mentions I had.
Well, I was going to say, I put Larry Brown as well. And I listed all these teams, and I never even heard of the Carolina Cougars.
ABA.
But it's still, and so, but the other interesting thing with him, he led 8 different teams to playoff wins. So that's just amazing. And he won a Coach of the Year again. He won a championship as well. And then a guy, again, because we do these lists, I never even heard the guy, John Kundala. Maybe you did but I never heard of Minneapolis Lakers.
Yeah.
He won 5 championships.
First dynasty, really.
So but again, that was way back before my time. And then I had the Don Nelsons, and I kind of feel bad with one of the guys I just put on the list because again, the Jordan factor, Jerry Sloan.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, seriously, that guy, who knows?
He might have 2 titles.
He could have had some titles. So, but
Yeah. I had some of the guys you had: Kundla, Daly, Wilkins, Larry Brown, or whatever. I had a couple others. I had Casey Jones. I had Billy C. Just because we're Philly, or we're outside Philly, Sixers. He had a .698 winning percentage from what I wrote or whatever I saw. And then I had Red Holtzman with the Knicks back in the 70s or whatever, Sloan. And I had Rudy Tomjanovich.
I actually had that name.
Yeah, he had. You have 2 rings?
Right.
2 rings. So he might have more.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are mine.
All right, well, there you go, guys. There you have it, our top NBA coaches of all time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. 2 Matts and a Jeff podcast.